Everyone, welcome to Mindgasms. I am, for the purposes of this video, Andrew, aka Postmodern Mindgasms, and I'm going to start a new series on the book called Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, of course, who like to fearmonger about postmodernism and critical theory and claim that they're connected to all of these so-called grievance studies like queer theory and anti-racism and critical race theory and so on, and feminism and so on and so forth. And lately, James Lindsay has slowly gotten more and more crazy and voted for Trump explicitly to suppress free speech because he wanted critical race theory to not be taught in schools. And he doesn't describe critical race theory in any way, shape, or form that's even remotely close to being accurate. And Helen Pluckrose, but Helen Pluckrose in particular seemed to harp on more on the point that there's this connection to postmodernism in terms of what they call well, not wokeness, but wokeism, which is connected to the crazy social justice warriors. And there are those people, and there are these things happening at universities with postmodernism. And whenever they describe any one of these different fields of thought or ideologies or philosophies, they conflate a whole bunch of details together and they cherry pick and they see it as this whole giant evil mutant woke monolith, which is really a whole bunch of bullshit pseudo intellectual cherry picking and nonsense. So I decided, because I thought their book Cynical Theories was so fucking terrible and inaccurate, I'm going to do a whole series on it, chapter by chapter. So this is chapter 1, and I'm basically focusing on their claim that there's a connection between postmodernism and critical theory, and that critical theory and postmodernism are basically the same thing. So I couldn't find a short clip with Helen Pluckrose, but I'm going to go through my notes here and show James Lindsay's tweet about the supposed connection between postmodernism and critical theory as the roots of wokeness, and go through the short video with him describing critical theory as he sees fit, along with my notes that are more directly relevant to chapter 1 of the book here. So here is his tweet, basically saying that the roots of wokeness are in both postmodernism and critical theory here. By the way, his Twitter name, he changed it, is so stupid. James Lindsay, weaponizing your mom. That's his actual Twitter. And his Twitter handle is Conceptual James, to make fun of like all the wokeness studies people, and he sees them as all the same thing. And look at the description of his Twitter page, based AF. What a fucking douche. Anyway, okay, so this is his tweet. This is from 2 years ago, but so I'm not sure if to what extent he still believes this, but he, at least in the Cynical Theories book, he and Helen Pluckrose both put forward this theory. So anyway, this is what he said. People really don't seem to understand that social justice isn't just a movement or some quirky ideas that got popular in some quarters, except actually it is. He was half right the first time. It's a worldview rooted in both critical theory and postmodernism. No, nothing to do with fucking postmodernism. These dumbasses like fucking James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson blaming the woke social justice warriors on postmodernism is just endlessly aggravating to me, because if you actually read Foucault and Derrida's work, I'm especially a fan of Foucault, and my favorite book of his is A History of Sexuality, which I did a video on recently, and you should check that out. I think he had some really worthwhile and interesting ideas, and people like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson and Helen Pluckrose strawman him all the fucking time. So it's not a world rooted in critical theory and postmodernism. Perhaps critical theory to a much greater degree, at least, than postmodernism, but I'll get into that in more detail. So he said, it's a worldview rooted in both critical theory and postmodernism. It is literally a completely different way to see and interpret the world. Well, he's right about that part, that it's a completely different way to see and interpret the world. But the thing that he and Helen Pluckrose and Jordan Peterson and so many others get confused about is that they seem to think that there's this there's this explicit intention and goal to destroy civilization, whereas if we're talking about deconstruction specifically, this is just rhetorical deconstruction with their words and basically analysis in writing. So anyway, the point that's the specific point that they get to in the chapter that chapter 1 of Cynical Theories is about, that is grossly inaccurate. So these are the notes that I said specifically in that relation to the point that the roots of wokeness are in critical theory and postmodernism, and that critical theory and postmodernism are basically the same thing. So the roots are not in postmodernism; they're in the Frankfurt School, which was Marxist. And what I've learned also since I've taken these notes, is that the Frankfurt School were not Marxist in the same way that classical Marxists like Marx and others were. The Frankfurt School Marxists, were they more kind of talked about, they gave like a cultural critique, and they talked about the aesthetics of fascism and sort of the culture of capitalism and the philosophical aesthetics of it in modern Western culture, basically. So but they did, so like Marx himself basically mostly talked about economics, contrary to right-wing criticisms of him. He wasn't actually explicitly political that much. He was more like, if you read Capital Volume 1, which is magnum opus, it's a super boring, dry academic book about economics, and it's not really that radical. But so anyway, the Frankfurt School Marxists like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, etc., who James Lindsay often talks about, are very different from Marxists in general, and he lumps these all together whenever he's talking about them and acts like this represents Marxism as a whole. So so-called postmodernists and Marxists hate each other, especially if we're talking about classical Marxists, like David Harvey, for example, who's a Marxist. I think he's either a philosopher or sociologist. He's a huge Marxist, and he hates postmodernism and Foucault and criticizes them all over the place. And a lot of postmodernists, like Foucault and Derrida and others, heavily criticize Marxism all the time. They said that there were good aspects of it, but totally like threw it out as an idea as a whole, even though that there are some good ideas that come along with it. Perhaps like some, for example, lefties like Ben Burgess, who I've talked to, think that his view of history seems accurate, that the economic interests of society and the material goods that people have access to influence their politics, which I think makes sense too. And if that's accurate, it's a little more complicated than that, but I still think that's accurate. Anyway, the point is that Derrida and Foucault heavily criticized Marxism a lot, and they were not Marxists. So Derrida, and this is they make claims like these. So I'm responding to claims that they made directly in the chapter. So they claim that Derrida said that everything in language and human interactions is a binary to do with power dynamics. No, Derrida, look through all of Derrida's writing. He never at any point said that everything in language and human interactions is a binary. They were an essential part of post-structuralism, which is what Foucault and Derrida were actually close to being, even though they rejected both the terms postmodernist and post-structuralist. And famously, of course, when a journalist first asked Foucault if he was a postmodernist, he said, "What is that?" So, but Derrida and Foucault were very against binaries. This was part of their whole critique of this of the modern era and the Enlightenment, that it put things into these binaries instead of having things on spectrums. So they did not set up binaries, and they did not say any. And Derrida, in particular, did not say that all of language is to do with power dynamics, because it was Foucault more specifically that talked about power dynamics than Derrida. Derrida himself barely talked about power dynamics at all, and he certainly never applied power dynamics to language, at least, and especially in terms of power dynamics of language as a binary. Definitely, specifically, never made that point anywhere. Read all of his writing; he never made that fucking point. Also, like I said, I mentioned deconstruction. It's merely rhetorical. It's not prescriptive for actions in the real world. Not, and it's, and So they get confused and say that, when Derrida and Foucault are coming up with these theories and these criticisms, that this means that they want this to actually happen in society, rather than that they're actually just criticizing ideas in their writing, which is what they're actually doing. So postmodernists were explicitly not cultural relativists. This is another thing that James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose claim in the chapter, that postmodernists were cultural relativists. This is fucking other stupid straw man. They never say that no culture is superior to every other. They don't look at all cultures equally. Every critique is possibly valid. Possibly valid. That doesn't mean that it is valid. That's what they thought. Every critique is possibly valid, not that every critique is valid, okay? There are not some that are invalid according to your position of oppression or lack thereof in a conversation or interaction. That's another claim that that Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay make in chapter 1 of Cynical Theories, that there are some critiques that are invalid according to your position of oppression or lack of oppression in a conversation with someone or in interaction. Like, you can't have this opinion because you're oppressed, or you can't have this opinion because you're not oppressed. And they use this as a point to say that they're hypocrites for advocating for cultural relativism, because they're supposedly not actually cultural relativists if you can't have if your cultural opinion is invalid due to your oppression or lack thereof. That whole fucking theory is bullshit, because they were not cultural relativists, and they didn't think that you have valid or invalid opinions depending on your oppression or lack thereof. All of this shit is complete fucking bullshit. So there's basically my notes about postmodernism and critical theory and those ideas, and them conflating these ideas in particular. So I'm going to go through this short video with James Lindsay on this other guy's channel, in which he's explaining critical theory as he sees it. So I'm just going to comment on this and basically say what he got wrong, and then give my further notes on the chat.
What is critical theory? I don't know what critical theory is.
Critical theory is a way to view the world. The long and short of it is that it's a way to view the world that sees the world in terms of then there are multiple critical theories. There are many critical theories. At its very bottom, it's a way to view the world where every...
Okay, so right away, it's not necessarily true that there are multiple critical theories, because in the book, he and Helen Pluckrose, and I think he's about to describe that here a little bit, describe that everything is a critical theory that they always talk about. All of the different theories that they talk about, whether they're political or ideological or philosophical, and whether they have anything to do with each other at all or not. So they claim that he and Helen Pluckrose in the book specifically go on to claim that postmodernism is a critical theory, which is bullshit. Obviously, critical theory is a critical theory, and the critical theorists were also Marxists, but that doesn't mean that Marxism is the same as critical theory, especially since, as I explained, the critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, their version of Marxism was very different from that of classical Marxists like Marx and others. And also, feminism has nothing to do with postmodernism or critical theory inherently. They're connected sometimes, but that doesn't mean that they're the same thing. They're different schools of thought. And the same with all of these other things, like critical race theory, which people like James Lindsay go around conflating with anti-racism, like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram X. Kennedy and Robin DiAngelo all the time, even though all three of these people say that they're not critical race theorists, that they're anti-racist, and that critical theorists say all the time that they are not anti-racist, and they criticize, and critical race theorists like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, who James Lindsay often mention, they criticize anti-racists like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates. So they're conflating all of these schools of thoughts together and more, and like queer studies and whiteness studies, even though the queer studies, whiteness studies, and anti-racism, those in particular are the most woke ones. The rest of them are not really woke, especially critical race theory. I'm not a fan of it, but again, they conflate it with anti-racism, and anti-racism is the weird woke shit. It's not critical race theory. That's mostly legal scholarship.
Everything relevant in terms at least of social relations has to do with power dynamics that are in society between some group with power and other groups who don't have as much power. And the object of critical theory is to say that the groups that have power carry certain assumptions and biases and the likes, and they bake that into the systems that they create without realizing that they're doing it. So the critical theorist's job is to...
Okay, so I want to go back for a second where he was talking about how they say that everything is about power dynamics. And again, of course, the critical race theorists, they don't really say that. They don't even sound like they're saying that everything is about power dynamics, and in interactions between people, everything is always about power dynamics, and it's about analyzing the power dynamics between these people based on whether they're oppressed or not, and their oppression and their levels of oppression, and all this shit about oppression Olympics. Like I've read people like Marcuse and Adorno and Horkheimer. They do talk about oppression, but they don't act like everything is about power dynamics and everything is about oppression. That's not that they don't really use the term power dynamics that much. And they don't talk about how, society is controlled by people in power, and people who don't have power don't get to have a relevant say in the matter. But they do actually make some good points when they're talking about how, similarly to what James Lindsay would talk about now, he says himself that people has this fucking conspiratorial narrative that the woke people have control of society, have the control of Hollywood and academia, and the wokesters control Biden and all this shit, so that his opinions that are critical of critical race theory and critical theory, and also all of this shit that he lumps in with it, like postmodernism and being pro-vaccine, or all this other sort of shit, is also linked to pedophile groomers and people who are trying to turn your kids gay and into trans people and shit like that. His completely fucking conspiratorial narrative is way more about fucking power dynamics and level of oppression between people than anything that the critical theorists say. So he's, at the very least, he and Helen Pluckrose does this in the book too. They're really massively oversimplifying critical theory, to say the least. Like, they talk about these things maybe, but it's sure as fuck not what they're all about. And it's not even close to as specific and narrow as what they're describing.
To expose those biases and uncover those assumptions so that they can be critiqued and re-examined and usually discarded, dismantled, subverted, or otherwise overthrown. So you would have...
So he's right about, analyzing and critiquing the biases and trying to overthrow them. But I mean, obviously you can't overthrow biases. And it's not like they're saying we have to go around examining people's biases and getting rid of them because these are the bad people's biases. It's not like they're saying this is our goal. He's conflating this again with like the woke activism and shit like that, which isn't true, and it's not an accurate description.
Have this in the Marxist sense, the power group would either be the capitalists or the bourgeoisie, which would be the property holding class. And they, in a kind of a very direct sense, control the working class.
So again, there he's talking about specifically classic Marxists like Marx and many others, and then he goes on to conflate this with critical theory by lumping in the version of Marxism and critical theory as if there's actually any link between that and classical Marxism as he's describing it here.
Class, and kind of control how they're supposed to think and set the fashion and set the tone of what high society is supposed to look like, or how the businesses are supposed to be operated, and they exploit the working class, which would be the oppressed group. Critical theory grew out of that mindset in what Institute for Social Research that was set up in Frankfurt, Germany in the 20s, that's now called the Frankfurt School. And they actually, following off of the Italian communist philosophy.
You could see that actually. That part's kind of accurate, because it's more, like I said, it's more the Frankfurt School in particular, but that's like, and critical theory too. That's more to blame for wokeness. But again, like he's not accurately describing them either.
Philosopher Antonio Gramsci realized that, you know, Marx predicted there would be this revolution, the proletariat would rise up and overthrow the capitalists and the bourgeoisie, and this didn't happen, and they wanted to know why. So Antonio Gramsci came up with this idea that's called cultural hegemony, and that's the idea that the powerful classes of society set the way that everybody's supposed to.
So I'm not familiar with Gramsci, so I don't want to comment on that. So if he's part of the part of the Frankfurt School, actually, I'm going to look that up right now while I keep playing this. But I'm not familiar with him in particular. I'm more familiar with Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse so far.
To think, and everybody else buys into that, so they won't go against it. And then the Frankfurt School kind of ran with this idea and started saying that things like liberalism and Western civilization themselves bake in the assumptions of their creators and make it so that the people who have power, which would mostly be white.
Okay, so he didn't mention this, and this is just a minor point here, but I just looked it up, and apparently Gramsci influenced the Frankfurt School, but he was not a member of it. So that's important to remember. But again, I don't know that much about Gramsci, so I want to clarify that too.
White Western men who are straight and so on have both explicitly and inadvertently cooked up systems of power so that they benefit.
Okay, again, so maybe Gramsci says this, but this is another thing. This is another thing that he does in general to just demonize this whole thing that he calls wokeness. The Frankfurt School critical theorists, like at least Marx, Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno, which are the main ones as far as I know, they never talk about straight white men. They don't have a problem with straight white men. Like I said, they're basically critiquing the culture, like cultural capitalism, I guess you could say, because like they're talking about it from the Marxist perspective, as he was saying. So what they care about is class, and they talk about ideology and the ideology of praising capitalism and this kind of shit. So they talk about it from the perspective of class. It's the rich, powerful people who are controlling society. To them, the critical theorists in general, they don't give a fuck that they're white men. It's not like they want there to be more black men controlling society or more women controlling society. They don't give a shit about the race and gender. This is another thing that he and Helen Pluckrose conflate all the time. They act like critical theorists also care about race and gender oppression, and all of these different fields care about all types of oppression. But no, they only the critical theorists and the Frankfurt School only care about class oppression. They don't give a shit about someone's race and gender, at least if you actually read and accurately describe the writing of many critical theorists like Marcuse and Adorno and Horkheimer.
Benefit themselves and exclude those that they don't want to have the power, because the power is a zero-sum object in this worldview. So critical theory is, in that sense, a way of looking at the world that sees the world that way, and that essentially tries to pick.
Okay, so then here's another thing that he does. He mentions one specific author and then says this is critical theory. So again, other critical theorists would disagree with this particular point that Gramsci apparently makes. It's not that It's not critical theory in a nutshell at fucking all. It's not that white men control society. It's that capitalists control society because they're fucking Marxists, as he fucking said. They don't. It's not describing critical theory in general to have a problem with white men. That part is fucking bullshit.
At whatever the system is, so as to tear apart the hidden assumptions and biases. That's the most charitable way to put it. That's what they say that they're doing, is tearing apart the hidden assumptions and biases
doing
to make the system more fair, or as they phrased it in the Frankfurt School, to make it into an ideal democracy, where nobody is actually has their voice or their opportunity or whatever shortchanged. So that's
I don't see the, like, again, he's oversimplifying there too, but I don't really see that as a problem. I mean, it depends on what you're going to do. Like, are you advocating for socially engineering society? That's what he and Helen Pluckrose go on to claim that they're doing in their books, Cynical Theories. But again, they don't fucking do that. It's about cultural critique from the perspective of class, like I said. They're not like fucking trying to re-engineer society.
It's a very long definition.
But at face value, that sounds, critical theory sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that, when used appropriately, a critical method at least, can be very, very useful. And in fact, the Enlightenment tradition, which has brought us, pretty much all of modernity, like the ability to Skype and have good microphones and things. The Enlightenment tradition could very easily be seen as an appropriate use of critical methods. It started to question.
Good for him. I think that's true.
The authority of, say, the church, and it started to say, let's defer to an external authority, essentially the way nature works, to answer our questions about the world, and let's try to appeal to reason and logic and evidence as much as we can in making our decisions. And so it started to create this very different way to see the world that presented a very useful skepticism against the previous kind of mythological and episcopate type and monarchical type mindsets, where you had these literally powerful individuals who then decided, either the interpretation of scripture or the organization of society or whatever, and whatever their fancy was how it went.
That's another thing that makes it worthwhile about reading so-called postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida. They criticize this, the similar things, but during the Enlightenment, as parts of the Enlightenment, as I talk in my videos on Foucault's history of sexuality, about how the institutions of science and religion made these declarations putting people into different categories. Like, one that Foucault talks about a lot is how they created the category of homosexual. There were gay people before them, but there wasn't this separate category, and it wasn't considered bad if you're gay. It just wasn't talked about as much. So the category of gay was created so that the church could declare homosexuality to be sinful, and so that the institution of science and medicine and psychiatry could declare homosexuality to be a psychological disorder. So that's a similar thing that post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida do.
The law was what the king said the law was, or the scripture is what the Pope interprets it to say, and so on. So yes, the issue is that a critical theory, this philosopher Max Horkheimer in the Frankfurt School laid out the difference between what's technically called a critical theory and what he called a traditional theory, both of which exist within a broader kind of critical thinking tradition that we would think of. And the point of a traditional theory is to understand a thing. It's just to understand it. The point of a critical theory is to understand how it goes wrong, and in particular, how it goes wrong according to some normative vision, which means a moral structure. And
I wouldn't say that even the critical theorists are moralizing, though. Especially so-called postmodernists or post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida. He's not talking about them here, of course, but that's not what they do. They sure as fuck are not moralizing. And he mentioned deconstruction, which is itself not moralizing, and the critical theorists don't do that, and they don't make it as much moralized statements. They do make fucking extreme statements that I totally disagree with, though. Like I made a video about how the dialectic of the Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer is about how they think that the Enlightenment itself was a mistake because it's fundamentally anti-Semitic. Now that's a fucking extreme statement, and you could say that that's moral too. So they did have more extreme claims, but that still wasn't their goal. They were basically mainly criticizing capitalism and how it's affected society and culture.
How to qualify as a critical theory, it must be explanatory about how it is particularly an unjust thing. So it's looking for injustices in the system and nothing else. No attempt to understand how the thing works necessarily, or why those injustices happen to be what they are, or something like this.
It's not necessarily that there's no attempt to understand. It's that sometimes they just assume they're a problem. Like, since they're Marxists, they assume that capitalism is a problem. I don't personally have a problem with capitalism inherently. Obviously, Marxists do. Even the critical theorists, they obviously did as well, even though the Marxists in the Frankfurt School, like Adorno and Horkheimer, etc., they obviously, as I mentioned, were different from classical Marxists, but still obviously had a problem with capitalism.
And it must fit the vision of the social engineers who have decided what justice looks like when they look for these injustices. And it must be applicable by...
Okay, again, there's nothing about social engineering. They don't say we should socially engineer society. Go and read the work of all of these people. They don't say that we have to socially engineer society and say how they should do it and or anything like that. So this is bullshit too.
Activists. And so it is, in a sense, a way of putting the cart ahead of the horse, where, you know, our best knowledge should lead our decision making rather than what we want to be true leading our approach to figuring out knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, but the point that critical theorists, and especially postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida, make is that it's impossible to not have these biases, because everyone has biases. So you're investigating what you want to be true, whether you want to or not. It's still better to try to go with the best evidence, but that doesn't mean that people don't have biases. Some people are just better at fighting their biases, but you still have to acknowledge them. It's not that the Enlightenment figures had no biases. They had biases just as much as the critical theorists, just as much as the postmodernists do. That's one point that critical theorists, and like I said, especially postmodernists, make a lot. And that's true. Everyone has biases, and acting like you don't and another group doesn't is ridiculous.
So yes, the best way that I can think of it is to actually, because I don't want to say that critical theory is useless, because it's not. It's odd that it gets applied to so much, given that it's mostly a literary thing, but
It is.
I try to say that it's like a really strong industrial solvent. It has applications, it has uses, but man, you're not going to spread it everywhere.
That's actually, I don't mind that description. Actually, this is from a while ago. I think it's from 2020, just like that tweet was. So it was when he was more charitable to it, and I would say more accurate, before he got all fucking crackpot conspiracy theorists about it, and about how, you know, the Great Replacement people are trying to engineer the woke fascist Marxist political agenda through forcing everyone to get vaccinated, and and forcing your kids to turn transgender and grooming them to be gay and all this kind of shit, that is all this kind of tinfoil hat that he talks about now. So that last part I think is actually relatively accurate.
You're not going to give it to kids. You're not going to just, dump it on everything you see. It's one of those things that certainly has beneficial and appropriate uses. We should be looking for those biases and those
there you go.
considered assumptions, but we should also do so responsibly, not with an effort only to pick at how something goes wrong. You must
Agreed.
also understand why the system or situation is the way that it is.
Agreed. See, I actually overall, I think his description makes more sense than other descriptions I've heard him make in the past of critical theory. Because as I said, he lumps all of this shit together way more now, and he doesn't talk about this with Helen Pluckrose as much anymore, which is why the Cynical Theories book is actually less fucking wacko than the shit that James Lindsay talks about now. And I don't know what Helen Pluckrose says about it, but anyway, so I mentioned that, and in relation to his tweet, where basically the focus is this supposed link between postmodernism and critical theory, which is bullshit, like I said. So these are the notes more directly based on the chapter, in relation to those subjects that he was just mentioning. So another claim that they make in chapter 1 of Cynical Theories is that postmodernists reject the individual and humanity. Now, of course, this is fucking bullshit too. Foucault and Derrida, they talked about the individual and humanity, but they rejected this Enlightenment's obsession with the individual and talked about how, historically speaking, this Enlightenmentite conception of the individual as being the focus of society is very recent in history, and it came along with the Enlightenment. They don't even necessarily say that that's bad. Again, they're being descriptive, not prescriptive, which is what deconstruction is. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. Foucault and Derrida and postmodernists are all about both the importance of the individual and humanity. That's what they're saying. They're saying that the individual, that one is not more important than the other. The individual is not more important than humanity, and humanity is not more important than the individual. They're both equally important. It's basically the individual and the collective are both equally important. That's what annoys me about people's political opinions. They say, no, the individual is what it's all about, or the collective is what it's all about. No, it's both. We're all individuals within humanity. We're all individuals within groups, within society. We're all individuals within collectives. So they're all about the importance of the individual and humanity. One is not necessarily important than the other. And then, of course, they get into, at the very end of the chapter, they say that activism scholarship is this term applied postmodernism, which is so fucking stupid. There's no such thing as applied postmodernism. It's not postmodernism. It's some stupid woke shit. There's no such thing as applied postmodernism. It's applied dumbass, relativist, anti-racist, whiteness studies, queer theory, and anti-colonial misinterpretations of the Frankfurt School, Marxism, and postmodernism. And it's just complete fucking dumbassery. That's what all this woke social justice warrior stuff is. It's not a consistent ideology with this links between all of these different fields of study. No, it's cherry picking a whole bunch of random nonsense to sound all crazy and do a whole bunch of incoherent bullshit activism. There's nothing coherent about this ideology that they're criticizing. My problem with the Cynical Theories and James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose talking about critical theory and postmodernism, and then all of these other fields of study, is that they're giving these woke people more credit than they actually deserve. Their activism is way less coherent than you think. And if you ask them about Foucault, they wouldn't know what the fuck they're talking about. Same with critical theory or any of these things. So there is no explicit agenda and social engineering or any shit like that. And if there is a problem with these fucking woke people, but there is no root in intellectual theories, in critical theory and postmodernism and so many others. So yeah, anyway, I thought it was good to go into that in detail. And like I said, I'm going to do a deep dive analysis of every chapter of this video because I thought it was important, because I think there's so much bullshit in there. So anyway, thanks everyone for watching. I always appreciate it. Click that like button, share this everywhere, click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. My last one, I believe, oh yeah, my last one was making fun of Jordan Peterson rage quitting Twitter because the new Sports Illustrated swimsuit model was too fat for him, which I thought was hilarious. And check out this upcoming week. This weekend, we're going to finally be doing that movie chat on Taxi Driver. Didn't get to do that this weekend, but that'll be really fun. And it's really relevant and kind of prophetic right now. And the movie Joker kind of copied it in some ways. And it's basically about incels and mass shooters. So that's pertinent right now, unfortunately, with the Buffalo mass shooting recently. And also, yeah, this weekend, or not this weekend, during the week, I might do a debate with my friend who disagrees with me about my critique of Jordan Peterson, what I see as Jordan Peterson's paranoia about this Bill 67 in Ontario, which is a mere proposal of what I do think is stupid, which is this like racial sensitivity bias training in Ontario schools, which I think is stupid, but he's paranoid that this is the worst Canadian legislation ever and it's going to become federal. So he agrees more with Jordan Peterson about that. So we're going to debate about that. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all, keeping the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And oh yeah, I forgot to say, check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description of the video. If you want to give me $1 a month, 5, 10, 100,000, however much you want to give me is greatly appreciated. And yeah, check out Cynical Theories. Disagree with me in the comments of the video, as I'm sure many of you will. In my experience, I think 100%, or at least 99.999% of people who comment on my critique of these people because they're ideological and cultish about people like James Lindsay, have criticized me while clearly having not actually read any of the fucking relevant text, which happens all the time. But yeah, come at me, bro, in the fucking comments, you dumbasses who haven't read these books. And yeah, just read them and see what you think for yourselves. If you actually read the books and have a legitimate criticism based on anything in the book, then I'm willing to have a respectful discussion with anyone about it. All right, so thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.